But I do have great pleasure in introducing Lieutenant Commander Desmond Wood, MSc OAM, who's a renowned historian, speaker in the Navy community and wider afield, and I'm sure many of you here have met him, read some of his work, and indeed spoken to him from time to time. He has had a colourful military career. He served for more than 4 decades, beginning in the Royal New Zealand Navy, unkindly known as the Polynesian POM by those of us who have heard that sort of service. Then he transferred across to the Royal Navy, to Britain, then to the British Army, and finally into the Royal Australian Navy as an education officer, teaching naval and military history and leadership to junior officers and senior sailors. In more recent times, he was the course officer for the Strategic Studies course at the RAN College from 2003 to 2010, and probably has a deep affection for life at Jervis Bay as a consequence. He was the military support officer to the Defence Community Organisation in Canberra for 2 years, before he joined the ceremonial staff of the RAN's International Fleet Review in 2013. If you were lucky enough to see it or be there for it, it was a pretty spectacular show. After a year as the Staff Officer Centenary of Anzac, brackets Navy, he joined the Chief of Navy's personal staff in what I believe is an elite role as his research officer and speechwriter for 3 years. So he was the hand up the Chief of Navy's back.
Thank you.
After time as a heritage research officer at the RAN Sea Power Centre in Canberra, he became the Chief of Navy's bereavement liaison officer, headed that up rather in 2019 through to 2022. And in 2022 he was awarded the OAM for his meritorious service in support of current and ex-service Navy people and their families. In 2023, he published The Modern History of the RAN Fleet Air Arm, brackets, Volume 2, or 2. He's currently on contract to the Department of Veteran Affairs, in the commemorative and history section, writing Navy history for Veterans Affairs Anzac Portal. He's a counsellor of the Australian Naval Institute and the Australian Institute for International Affairs in the ACT. He's a member of United Services Institute in the ACT and an author of a regular contributor to Australian and international naval historical journals. So I know that was a little long-winded, but it was a colourful and interesting career. And I hope you'll join me in giving a warm welcome to Lieutenant Commander Desmond Woods.
Thank you very much. In my own defence, I can only say that I always fight on the same side for the same Queen. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Naval Historical Society of Australia, Victoria Chapter, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to be your speaker. I'm honoured to address such a distinguished gathering. Tonight I'm going to talk to you not about the Navy's complex new hardware, but about its much older software, otherwise known throughout history as the greatest single factor. Here we go. There it is. I mean, of course, our sailors and officers who serve the nation at sea and ashore, male and female. I'm going to address how and why the culture of the Navy that we joined has changed dramatically during our lifetimes and will continue to evolve because it has to. Now, Navy culture is a tricky subject to discuss. That's because it's an overlay of many cultures. There's the Navy culture, the cultural ethos of the branch and the ship, and then each specialization. And you see this as you walk through a ship. But tonight I'm speaking about the ideas, customs, norms, regulations, and social behavior of the Navy. The point of origin for the Royal Australian Navy was, of course, the RN. Indeed, it's true to say that without the RN's people, training, and UK-built ships, the RAN could not have become the powerful instant fleet that steamed into Sydney Harbour. Oh, wrong way. In October 1913. Almost all the officers and more than half the sailors on the battle cruiser and the escorts were in fact RN. And the ships were owned by the Australian government, but dependency on the RN for senior officers to command the RAN fleet and senior sailors to man it would take a generation to entirely disappear. Before the RN, but the RAN's culture was never just a clone of the RN. The egalitarian nature of Australian society made it much more meritocratic from the outset than the RN was. Unlike the Royal Navy, the RAN paid for the tuition and uniforms for its cadet midshipmen. As a result, the intakes were drawn from both the working and the middle class. And 3/4 of the first intake of the Naval College in 1913 came from state schools. Indeed, one was an orphan. By contrast, the UK government required naval officers and naval midshipmen cadets to be trained at the expense not of the state but of their middle-class parents. That limited who came in. National culture matters, and it's reflected in the naval culture. Notably, Australian sailors were also paid better than their British counterparts, and that helped attract men and boys from a wider cross-section of society. Now, as you've heard, I've served in 3 Royal Navies. I commissioned first into the RNZN in 1974, and it was, as you alluded to, Andrew, still culturally in many ways the New Zealand division of the Royal Navy, which it had been up until 1941. My father, whom you see pictured there, was a Surgeon Lieutenant Commander RNZN. In 1956, I went to sea with him for a Sons at Sea Day in that World War II Lock-class frigate HMNZS Carnegie. By the end of the day, at 5 years of age, I decided what I was going to do with my career, and did. A year later, my father was in Edinburgh on a naval fellowship, training to be a paediatrician, and an elderly Scottish surgeon asked him, "What's your speciality in New Zealand?" And my father said rather proudly that he was a naval surgeon, to which the Scotsman said with a twinkle in his eye, "My God, that's getting very specialised." There was much in our Navy's past culture that needed to evolve or to be changed entirely. As the late Queen said on her only state visit to Dublin, we can all wish that many things had been done differently or not at all. But in accepting the truth of this statement, there's no need to dismiss our heritage or discount the dedication to duty and sacrifice of our own and our naval forebears. High standards of technical innovation and adoption were rightly insisted on by dedicated professional officers and sailors in the past, all the way back to the beginning of our Navy, and that is unchanged. But we must also acknowledge that sometimes what happened at sea and ashore was, by today's standards, unwise, sometimes psychologically counterproductive, unjust, or even downright unhealthy and dangerous. The inevitable result of our ships and submarines being full of asbestos and toxic lubricants and fuels are now apparent and tragically well known to all of us who lost former shipmates to mesothelioma and rare cancers. These chemical hazards which killed them, they had no control over. But premature death was also caused by the customs and culture accepted and even encouraged in ships. I refer to cheap cigarettes, smoking in confined places with too much alcohol too easily obtained and too often. That was not always a safety-first culture when it needed to be. Death was the consequence for 4 young midshipmen sent to sail around Hook Island in the Whitsundays in 1963 in one of HMAS Sydney's whalers, a vessel that was entirely unsuitable and unsafe in a rising sea state. They protested. Wiser counsel should have listened to them on board the carrier, and their sailing should have been cancelled. It wasn't. They lost their lives. The following year, the Voyager disaster took place, and Captain Stevens and his bridge team lost their situational awareness at night. 84 of the destroyer's crew died when the ship turned under Melbourne's bow and was cut in half. That tragic night takes us to the subject of competent leadership at sea and ashore. Undoubtedly, the Navy is now a far safer, more diverse, more meritocratic service than at any time in its past. But I do not dismiss the achievements of our many outstanding leaders from earlier generations. We know we stand on their shoulders. Indeed, two of our most respected and admired lost leaders of World War II, both killed in action, would have fitted in very well to our modern naval culture. I refer to Captain Emile Deschenaux and Heck Waller. They were empathetic, high-functioning team builders. Wonderful men whose crews would follow them anywhere, even if only out of curiosity. So would Captain Harry Howden, the much-respected captain of the cruiser HMAS Hobart, and Captain Harold Farncombe of HMAS Australia, known to his sailors as Fearless Frank, because he stated when they were chasing shear in the North Atlantic that regardless of whether he was alone or in company, he intended to take shear on. Everybody was very impressed by his courage, not very impressed with the chances of surviving. When he commanded Perth pre-war, sailors gave him the name February Farncombe, because they knew if they appeared at the captain's table, they'd always get 28 days stoppage of leave. There have always been such exemplary leaders, men like Rear Admiral Andrew Robertson, DSC, and Chief Petty Officer Jonathan Rogers, George Cross. They embodied courage and professionalism, but they also demonstrated humanity, wisdom, self-sacrifice, and generosity. There were tens of thousands of other good leaders like them who served in the post-war Navy. We knew them. They trained and mentored us. We worked as members of their team. We're grateful to them for their kindness and their forbearance, and we revere their legacy. However, while we remember with the great majority of our excellent officers and senior sailors, we cannot forget that the Navy of our youth also promoted a few individuals to ranks and appointments for which they were, to say the least, ill-prepared or temperamentally unsafe. Some of our senior officers were better ship drivers than they were people managers. There were a few who weren't good at either. And some senior sailors lacked wisdom or patience, and they made life in training establishments unsafe, unpredictable, and sometimes intolerable for those who served under them. Their idiosyncratic approach to leadership would in today's training establishments be unacceptable. Their erratic, even eccentric behavior, sometimes fueled and exacerbated by alcohol, was abuse. It was not good to be on the receiving end of it, whether you were on the bridge or on the drill square, and was often excused as just being a part of naval customs. Shouldn't have joined if you can't take a joke, was the saying of the day, and was often used as a justification for humiliation and belittlement of junior officers and sailors. Research has shown that good leadership is not a random distributed gift of the gods or the birthright of just a few charismatic born leaders. Practical leadership can be taught, learned, and developed. But like an athlete, these skills need to be regularly exercised if they're to be fit for purpose on the day of the race. Once trained and educated, Navy leaders of all ranks can and should be held accountable for the results they achieve with and for their people. There is an invisible bank on board our ships. You won't find it next to the canteen or near the sick bay, but it exists nonetheless. It's the bank of mutual obligation. Successful Navy leaders, captains, XOs, heads of department, try to keep a healthy surplus in the account in the ship's bank of mutual obligation, so that if they will have to make a very large, sudden withdrawal on the goodwill of the ship's company, they won't go bankrupt. It happens. Successful leadership of sailors is now, and always has been, best achieved by making the Navy's well-proven divisional system work with fairness and opportunity for all. That's always been true. Now we acknowledge it and we teach practical divisional leadership formally to our people at every career point, from leading seamen to COXO designate courses, and our star ranks learn the leadership skills they need for their higher duties throughout their careers, and they have the opportunity to hone them at Staff College. So what I'm saying is the modern Navy, we've entrenched ethical conduct in our core values. That's to remind people that all our leaders must demonstrate that they're capable, competent, and psychologically safe people to work with and for. No exceptions are tolerated, as they once were in years gone by, when a few senior sailors and a few officers were permitted to run permanently unhappy ships without being re-educated or relieved of command by timely intervention from on high. Now to the matter of gender and the Navy's evolving culture. There is no more important story, and it starts a long time ago. As you can see, the UK briefly pioneered a women's Royal Navy service at the end of the Great War. It was formed in 1917. It only survived 2 years before being disbanded in 1990. It came back into existence in 1939 in Plymouth, just before the war broke out. 200 young Wren recruits were sent to train in Plymouth and to work at HMAS Drake. One of the Wren's temporary all-female barracks ashore was initially named, presumably without much consideration for the consequences, after one of the old wooden ships of the line still used as a training ship. That decision meant that those 200 girls were walking around Plymouth in uniform, a town full of Marines and sailors, with their cap tallies all claiming that they were impregnable. There they are. When the war came, of course, cap tallies disappeared. But also when the war came, thousands more Wrens were quickly accepted into service. There were very severe shortage of navy blue Barathea cloth, so it was decided to prioritise the issue of uniform to seagoing sailors and not to Wrens. It is alleged that a signal came from their lordships in the Admiralty on the subject, which could have been better worded. It read, "As a temporary measure, a decision has been made that all female clothing will be held up until male requirements are satisfied." Not an auspicious start. The RAN was slower off the mark to create the RANs, and as you see there, it was the wonderful work of Mrs. Violet Mackenzie, who saw the requirement for a women's emergency signalling corps, training girls in Morse. She was a brilliant civil engineer. Her first 14 girls went to Harman to relieve male wireless telegraphers so they could be posted to sea. They became the very first RANs. Shortly after that, one of these young women at Harman was the brilliant, pioneering Perth barrister Sheila McClemens. By the war's end, Chief Officer McClemens was the director of the RANs, and she had under her command 105 officers and nearly 3,000 women working in all the roles which male officers and sailors had handed over so they could man the fleet. The RANs were soon, from zero, 10% of the naval strength, and they became indispensable. They were the Y-station Japanese codebreakers. They were the harbour boat drivers. They were the supply officers and stores accountants. They were the sick berth attendants. They were running the gunnery and degaussing ranges. They were doing everything that the male-only Navy normally did ashore. They were doing it very well, arguably often better, and they were doing it for only 75% of their brothers' pay. There you can see them collecting their pay. The newly formed Royal Australian Naval Nursing Service, the RANS, was running the Navy's many hospitals in Australia and one in the Southwest Pacific at Milne Bay. So by the war's end, the Navy understood how vital women had been to getting ships to sea and relieving men ashore. Their retention post-war had the support of the Chief of Naval Staff, Lewis Hamilton, and his senior officers. Sailors didn't want to see the girls go back to civilian life. Sailors loved the RANs, and the RANs loved them right back. They often married them. And then, of course, the axe fell. and it was announced in 1946 by the Chifley government that the following year all three women's services and the nursing services were to be disbanded because they apparently were going to be unnecessary in peacetime. The director of RAND, Sheila McClemens, tried to prevent this act of short-sighted misogyny. In Navy headquarters here in Melbourne, she wrote a legally watertight, widely circulated paper outlining why this policy was a serious mistake. Her point was that in a post-war Navy where male recruiting targets were going to be hard to achieve, why would you get rid of women who wanted to serve on and had just demonstrated their utility and versatility? But her paper was ignored by the civilian policymakers, and on the 27th of February 1947, Sheila closed the door on the RANs, took off her uniform, went back to Perth to start a distinguished career of public service to women who needed legal advice and representation. Then in 1951, the Korean War once again demanded men from the depots and on ships at sea. The 1947 political blunder was recognised and reversed. All three women's services had a second birth, and that year, Sheila McClemens, now married and practising in the matrimonial courts, was awarded a military list Order of the British Empire for her outstanding service as the first director of RANS. Perhaps it was also an acknowledgement that she'd been right all along. The RANs were indispensable to a modern navy. Indeed, Admiral John Collins had lamented the disbandment of the RANs and was determined its rebirth would be a great success. But the bar to married women serving was now very strictly enforced. So even if she'd wished to, Sheila, who was now married, and most of her generation of wartime RANs were not eligible to serve again. The few single ones who were allowed in were stripped of their wartime seniority. In 1959, the RANs were designated as a permanent part of the Navy, as were the other two services, the WAFs and the AWAS, and subject for the first time to the Naval Discipline Act. It was a start, but it was not till 1969 that the policy requiring women to retire permanently from naval service when they're married was finally abolished. And in 1974, the automatic discharge of pregnant service women was challenged in court, and discriminatory regulation was made illegal and quashed. In 1978, equal pay for men and women was implemented by law, and in 1980, the very first Navy women went to sea in the RAN's non-combatant ships, starting with Jervis Bay. Their uniform, as you can see, their ceremonial uniform, was their white bowling dress, attractive but hardly practical. But bigger changes were coming, and with the Sex Discrimination Act of 1983, the continued existence of women's separate services became legally unsustainable, and in 1984 the RANs laid up their colours and Navy women were offered full careers in the RAN at sea and ashore. RAN's chief officer, Sheila McClemens, lived just long enough to see it all happen. Some countries were faster than others to respond to the need for change. New Zealand led the way. I was serving in the RNZN in 1977 when the Women's Royal New Zealand Naval Service was disbanded and integrated into the mainstream Navy. And it was a breakthrough because these RNZN women were the first in the Commonwealth posted to combat ships. Australia was well ahead of the RN, where that final restriction lasted until 1990. When I was serving in the RN and British Army, I saw the UK disband its three women's services in 1990. Later that year, in 1990 and into 1991, I served with the British Army and their women in the Gulf War. They were the former Women's Royal Army Corps, driving us in their trucks into Kuwait, guided by something entirely new, which none of us had ever heard about, called satellite navigation. Brilliant. Some of us thought it might even be possible one day to have one in your own car. A few Navy women, former Wrens, were posted to HMS Brilliant, and they remained on board when the ship deployed to the Gulf to back down incoming Scud missiles from Saddam Hussein. So they, as far as I am aware, are the first women in a combat ship in combat roles. By the time of the Second Gulf War in 2003, RAN, RN, and RNZN Navy women were integrated into the ship's operations. The then captain and later Vice Admiral Peter Jones commanded the multinational maritime interception force off the Iraqi coast in 2003, and he had over 30 coalition warships pass through his force. And he told me he thought that generally the mixed-gender ships performed very well, particularly on the extended periods on station. He remembers on 5-inch Friday listening to the communication between Anzac, them bombarding the Al-Faw Peninsula, and a UK Royal Marine spotter ashore observing the fall of shot. Small arms fire could be heard in the districts, as was the calm professional voice of a young female sailor in Anzac's operation room. Anzac's bombardment was being conducted by a female principal warfare officer not much older than that young sailor. Emancipation of Navy women was cultural as well as legal. These changes in gender role were mandated for armed forces of the democracies by new equal opportunities legislation in each country. That's true. But getting women to sea was also a wider response to each Navy's need to release women from obsolete cultural restrictions and free them to work in the mainstream workforce on ships as well as ashore. They no longer freed a man for the fleet, they served in the fleet as officers and sailors, and absolutely necessary that they did so. But there was, of course, a bit of pushback. Change always encounters pushback. I remember it being reported in the UK Daily Telegraph that the wives of some Royal Navy sailors wrote to the First Sea Lord expressing deep concern about their husbands being made to serve at sea with young women, and what they feared were the inevitable consequences for their marriages. When they couldn't get anything out of the First Sea Lord, they petitioned the Lord High Admiral, the Queen, to put a stop to it. It is not reported what, if anything, Her Majesty, as a naval wife herself, wrote back to these fellow wives, or if her husband, Admiral of the Fleet, Prince Philip, commented on their complaint, probably just muttered under his breath. There were some well-publicised gender-related issues in RAN ships, particularly in HMS Swan in 1993, where allegations of sexual assault and harassment made by the female medical officer and other female crew members were substantiated. The matter prompted a larger Senate inquiry into sexual harassment across the entire Australian Defence Force, and Chief of Navy Ian McDougall apologised to the women who had been affected. But there were also considerable successes at the same time. The first mixed-gender warship with a sizable female contingent, HMS Sydney, successfully deployed to the Middle East in 1993, and the women did exactly the same duties as the men, being part of boarding parties, fast roping from helicopters, and interestingly, the ship had fewer punishment returns compared to when Sydney was an all-male ship. And that was a welcome and enduring change to the way in which ships worked and discipline was administered. Expectations and male attitudes had to change, as did the design of accommodation in new ships. Navy women rightly demanded and got the respect at sea that they'd long had on shore. Women demonstrated they were good at all the jobs given to them, whether that was working in the galley, the engine room, the upper deck, in boats, or on the bridge. Change to a culture of routine lunchtime drinking in messes, ashore and afloat, coincided with the integration of women into the RAN at sea. It was finally realised that the tradition of high levels of alcohol availability and drinking when off watch was affecting the efficiency and safety of the ship. Making use of alcohol exceptional, not ubiquitous, was a long overdue workplace reform that produced dramatic dividends in reduced ship's punishment returns and accidents. But cultural change takes time to consolidate, and our last male-only manned ship, the DDG HMAS Brisbane, was not decommissioned until 2001. In those days, DDG was said to stand for Don't Do Girls. Some ship classes just couldn't be modernised to permit women to serve at sea, and these Perth-class DDGs were completely unsuited to mixed-gender manning and couldn't be adapted. Their design with large heads and showers off main passageways and large mess decks came from a previous generation. The last restriction on categories of women serving at sea was only removed when our first female submariners were awarded Dolphins and deployed in Collins-class boats in the 1990s, and look at the proportion of them there are now. Women can now seek to become clearance divers. An all-female aircrew flew a Sea King helicopter from HMAS Albatross for the first time in about 2005. It's now a regular event. When our ships sail with a new commanding officer who's female, there is no speculation about her right to command. Everyone knows she's the ship's captain because she's qualified, tested, experienced, and ready for command. Her taking the weight from a male officer is unremarkable and unquestioned within the service, and so it should be. A future first female Chief of Navy is probably gaining her command experience at sea at the moment, or she is already a star-ranked officer in Navy headquarters halfway up the greasy pole. There's about to be another round of revelations of alleged misdeeds by ADF members. Allegations were made last month by former serving women who have brought a class action against the ADF, which they claim did not expose and evict those individuals who harassed and preyed on them during the last 25 years. If any of the accused who are still serving are found to have been hiding in plain sight all these years and are convicted of criminal charges in a court, then the service chiefs will rightly dismiss them as a consequential naval penalty of that conviction and as a lesson for the next generation of would-be abusers. Now that is a welcome change to an ADF service culture which for a good part of last century was averse to even hearing from victims of in-service bullying, harassment and abuse, far less believing them. For at least the last 30 years, to my knowledge, there's been consistent effort to get rid of sexual predators, but that's an ongoing task in the ADF, as it is in society at large. Inclusiveness and equity in the contemporary Navy extends beyond gender to sexual orientation. I think we all remember that was not always the case. The RAN was not as hostile to homosexuality as the RN was, where the naval police coxswains used active entrapment and dismissal on discovery. That was routinely practiced. But the RAN's attitudes probably deterred gay men and women who might have served from seeking a Navy career for decades. That's rightly a thing of the past. The ADF has followed the developments in Commonwealth legislation on sexuality and has changed attitudes across the services. A recruit's sexual orientation is now rightly regarded as being as irrelevant as gender, faith, ethnicity to a person having a successful naval or military career. Now I turn to another discriminatory practice which we've left behind. I refer to the Naval Officers List System. Before ADFA started in 1986, General List Cadet midshipmen trained at the Naval College and went to get a university degree in Sydney, while those on the supplementary list trained at Cerberus, Flinders Naval Depot, for immediate sea duty. No degrees for them. It was expected that those 15-year-old boys selected for the general list would one day get the brass hats of the senior officer from their number would come those competing for flag rank. Supplementary list entrants were not expected to get beyond lieutenant commander unless they were selected mid-career for transfer to the general list. Some were. But career and promotion opportunities were offered to the general list which were not available to the supplementary list. Now think about it. Deciding which teenager should go on which lift, GL or SL, was an invidious business for those involved in making that choice, and it resulted in expectations being set and distinctions being drawn far too early in a midshipman cadet's career. And once on the general list, even poor-performing officers were never demoted to the SL. Deciding which SL officers should be later transferred mid-career to the general list was also less than transparent. There were many good officers who should have been transferred to the GL who never were. And that meant that they were discharged when their return of service obligation was completed. If you think that's bad, the special duties list for senior sailors who were commissioned as officers mid-career was even more restricting than the supplementary list. Most SD officers never got beyond the lieutenant, regardless of their talent. Now, this list system was abolished in the 1990s in favour of a meritocratic, open-ended and much fairer selection and promotion process, which, while not perfect, is serving Navy far better than that GL, SL, SD system ever did. Navy now commissions and promotes talented people in the rank they need to be for their maximum effectiveness without other considerations. Where you start your training does not inevitably determine where you finish and on which deck, as it did in the recent past. High-performing officers can expect a commission and go to ADFA. High-performing junior sailors can expect a commission and go to ADFA to get relevant degrees in exchange for a return of service obligation for a fixed number of years. That is a meritocratic ladder, similar to the old upper yardsman scheme, which has always made junior officers' careers as officers possible. Commissioning from the lower deck is not new. Nelson's boss, Vice Admiral Sir John Jarvis, Earl St Vincent, ran away to sea at 13 in 1749 and joined the RN as naval seaman. Didn't do too badly. Captain James Cook was a self-educated senior sailor. Our current CN, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, joined as an electronics technician in 1986 and graduated from ADFA in 1980. So the meritocratic ladder is in place as it should be. The age at which Navy farewells its people has also been reconsidered. Retiring age for rank, which I know affected many of you here, is no longer a barrier to keeping valuable people in uniform, because regular extensions of compulsory retirement age past 60 has positive manning results for Navy. My last day of uniform service was my 72nd birthday in June 2023, and I chose my date to retire. My point is that in a manpower-constrained Navy, we finally learned to be less wasteful with our highly trained and experienced older people. The RAN leads the way globally on this and is way ahead of Army and other navies in keeping talented and useful people serving in uniform longer. And Chiefs of Navy now offer short-term contracts when it's in the interest of the Navy to do so to recently retired officers and senior sailors. That allows niche workforce areas ashore to benefit from hard-to-find subject matter expertise and Navy to retain its institutional memory. It also adds another welcome element of diversity, older members, to our integrated Navy workforce. Navy fosters, educates and trains young Indigenous men and women aged 17 to 35 at HMAS Cairns so that whenever possible, they are, in all respects, ready for success at recruit school at Cerberus. Increasing the number of Indigenous sailors entering and staying in the Navy is still a work in progress. But that 5-month-long program at Cairns, which has been running for many years now, allows us to produce many more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sailors than were recruited without these measures being in place in the past. Navy also fosters end-of-secondary school gap year students to try being in Navy's workforce for a year before committing to a full career. And the conversion rate for gap year students is excellent. These try-before-you-buy young people are excited by the prospect of serving on after the year is up. In 2019, Navy Vice Admiral Mike Noonan, Chief of Navy, took another step towards an integrated workforce when he dropped that final R from the Royal Australian Navy Reserve post-nominal. That reflects the new reality. All Navy people are now truly, and for the first time, all of one company, just RAN. Everyone can now move within those flexible, numbered service categories of employment from full-time to a number of employed days per year. The hard edge between being a reservist or a member of the Permanent Naval Force, PNF, has been largely erased, and there are now well-trodden bridges which span the career opportunity chasm between regular and reserve that has existed since the birth of the RAN. And leaving the Navy for the expensively trained member is no longer a once and forever decision. It's often reversible, and it need not be a career-threatening move to step out into civilian employment, gain relevant experience, skills, qualifications before returning them to make that knowledge and skill available to Navy. So what I'm suggesting is that the current Navy is now operating more like the wartime emergency 1939-45 Navy, which recruited talented civilians and swiftly put them in uniform because we had to. From 1940 on, thousands of semi-trained, often still green and seasick, young RN and RAN volunteer reserve wavy Navy officers were posted to small ships commanded by regular, seasoned and salty RN straight-laced officers. It was said by some of these British RN regulars that RNVR stood for really not very reliable. Amusing and possibly even true in 1940, but such condescending attitudes were soon overcome, and the in-for-life professionals and the hostility-only volunteers, like Doug Gilling over there, very quickly became very good indeed. Some of them later commanded at sea, as Doug did with great success. They learned their business, they formed official teams, they went on to hunt U-boats and win the Battle of the Atlantic together. The RA and Dominion Yachtsmen's officer and sailors were an important part of that success story, and in the room we have Jan, who wrote the book on that subject. There she is there. Yes. Give her a hand. Recruiting talent where it is to be found was then and is now a sensible way to build a flexible, high-performance workforce. It's a critical pathway to follow if the Navy is going to grow quickly, as it must do, to meet the increased manpower ceilings which will be required to crew the expanded surface fleet and our nuclear-powered submarines in the next decades. So Navy has enlarged the lateral entry system whereby civilians with specialist skills can join at an appropriate rank for their civil qualifications. They bring to Navy great civilian technical and work experience and ability to train our junior sailors. In response to a former period of critical marine engineering shortages, a now retired CN, Tim Barrett, decided to try to recruit some mid-career Qantas tradesmen to work at sea on marine gas turbine engines, very similar to those which they were already qualified to maintain on aircraft. They were going to come straight into the Navy as petty officers, so they would not be financially disadvantaged if they were brought in as sailors. It was pointed out to Tim Barrett that unless they did their basic training at Cerberus first, they wouldn't be able to march. CN said, "I decide on sailors' branch badges, so I'll get one made up for them, which means qualified marine engineer, but can't march, and that'll solve the problem." So how much has really changed in officers' and sailors' capabilities in recent memories, I hear you ask? Well, in my experience, this new generation of Navy people is not more or less intelligent than those young sailors and mids I trained and educated in the 70s and 80s. But their intelligence is channeled in new directions in each generation. Increasingly, our 21st century recruits are digital natives brought up in the online and now AI world that they find in our ships. What is also noticeable is that officer recruits do not have a monopoly on higher education qualifications. Some of our sailors join recruit school here with university degrees and high-level trade qualifications. Also new is that in recent decades, we've been bringing in older recruits who come in with a wealth of experience in the workforce. Many of them are parents. Relationships between ranks in the contemporary Navy are perhaps less formal than they once were. Ashore, many wardrooms have been replaced by combined officers and senior sailors' messes. And in my experience, that adds strength and depth to how officers and senior sailors work and learn together in mutually respectable and respectful teams. Wise junior officers have always learned from and been mentored by old and bold senior sailors at sea. My first time at sea was in the RNZN World War II Bathurst-class corvette Inverell. On the bridge in a heavy sea, there was a very highly experienced RNZN Chief Petty Officer watchkeeper who told me there was only one order I would need to give to anyone, and that was to respond to his requests with the words, "Carry on, please, Chief." He was right. That's all I needed all night. Many technical junior sailors are now very much computer keyboard professionals using brains rather than brawn in their job at sea. But that doesn't mean that they can't turn to and run a replenishment at sea line in a gale, or form an armed boarding party in a rigid-hull inflatable boat in a 3-metre swell. Men and women still do those basic seamanship tasks, as they've always done, as part of the routine whole-of-ship duties, regardless of their branch. That hasn't changed. Men and women do it together now. That's normal. So, below decks, in the engine room, the old and bold 3-badge A.B. stoker's oily sweat rag and his mighty thirst at the end of his watch on the plates of a superheated boiler room in the steam navy are gone. With his sweat and oily rag have gone his colourful language and his rampant sexism. Also gone is his too often becoming over-refreshed in dockside pubs, coming back on board with a broken nose and ready for a very long rest on his bunk, which he needed help to find. He is now like his red-hot Admiralty 3-drum boiler, which powered his ship and his thirst, virtually extinct. Camaraderie and a sense of being all of one company at sea without alcohol is a far better way of giving people high morale, and it's based in realistic training and good leadership and team building. Now to our Navy's revered traditions, which have never been, as Churchill once inaccurately claimed about the Royal Navy, just rum, sodomy and the lash. Good naval traditions support ethos, pride and exceptional performance, but they can't be permitted to become immovable barriers to progress. It's said that Nelson once wrote to his captains, his band of brothers, saying words to the effect of, "I never permit anything to be done at sea just because it's a tradition of the Navy, unless there's another good reason to support its usage as well." If he didn't say it, he should have done. He was a fighting admiral who was centuries ahead of his time in leadership and man management. He understood that a tradition or customary practice must justify itself in every generation or be ditched. Our Navy's culture had to transform, and some pointless, socially unacceptable rituals had to be cast overboard to meet the legitimate expectations of the men and women who joined Creswell and Cerberus this century and their parents who sent them. We also had to cast overboard the idea that we were still some offshoot of the Admiralty and that our flag and the rest of the Empire's flag should be one and the same. So as you see there, Harold Holt's statement that the Queen has approved a new ensign for the RAN. It'll be called the Australian White Ensign. We'd be proud to serve under the same ensign as the Royal Navy, but it's now appropriate to adopt a flag which, while indicating our allegiance to the Crown, is distinctively the flag of the Royal Australian Navy. That was a tradition that we had to say goodbye to. But there are other things we can hang on to. Who hasn't been there? Harry's Café de Wheels being opened, HMAS Harry being opened by David Martin, and our sailors still go there. We still celebrate crossing the line, but we don't have weird and highly questionable ceremonies anymore, as occurred in the 1990s. Things happened in 1995 on board the casing of HMAS Ovens, which got filmed and then televised, and we don't want to see that again. On Tuesday, we toast our sailors, not our men. On Saturday, we no longer toast our wives and sweethearts, may they never meet. We toast our families instead. The evolution of naval uniforms in recent decades and relaxation of dress codes for Liberty men is also a reflection of societal changes and the Navy keeping in step. It may or may not surprise you to learn that gunnery instructors now use a moderate tone of voice, restrained vocabulary, and a no-touching rule to ensure that the parade ground drill is done to high standards. Such restraint works very well. Who knew? Perfection can still be achieved at divisions without instructors bellowing at, belittling and humiliating trainees for a week. There has to be a balance preserved between the Navy's traditions and the evolving culture of Australia and Australians. Navy cannot be completely distinct from Australian society, nor can it be just a reflection of its societal recruiting base lacking its own distinctive heritage and traditions. It can't be run as a remote, self-referring priesthood, as its officer corps once was. Nor can it be just another bland, Australian corporation. That would be to sap our sailors' morale, deny our history and Navy's unique mission, which is, uniquely and legitimately, to use lethal force at sea on behalf of the state. No one else does that. We are unique. Maintaining that equipoise is never easy, but the unchanging naval traditions of decency, personal self-sacrifice, discipline and integrity must be central to that continuous culture. Belief that Navy people will, if necessary, fight courageously for Australia and serve honourably is why our citizens still find the Navy and its culture admirable and why it can recruit new members in each generation. New Generation Navy was the first name for the overarching cultural renewal program that started in 2007. Next Generation Navy, which took over from it in 2019, continues to keep Navy culturally agile and moving in step with most societal expectations. NGN has achieved a high performance and simultaneously empathetic naval culture. It's even attracted interest from the banks who want to know from the Navy a successful model of cultural change to learn from. There are its 5 cultural pillars. Value our people, develop leaders who value their teams, enhance resilience, instill a sense of purpose, and drive for professional mastery. Quantifiable benefits and advantages have flowed to Navy from NGN since 2007. Navy's separation rate has improved in just a decade, on average in some branches, by nearly 30%. Breath testing positive for alcohol dropped by 58% in that decade. Critical shortages of sailors in key technical areas also went down. And combined, these have contributed to a 21% annual increase in days at sea by the fleet. That's progress, and it's renewal driven by NGN. Retention is, and always will be, in a high-performing society like ours, where pay is high in civilian life, a permanent challenge, but we're meeting it head-on. Our ships are increasingly crewed by sailors and officers of Gen Z. They're born after 1997. They have only ever known the modern reformed Navy. That culture is their natural home. It has their values, which are inclusive, gender-neutral, and multicultural. Men and women understand and can be proud of these values, and crucially, they wish to remain serving for a long term in such a Navy. The tradition of naming new entry officer divisions at the Naval College after famous Royal Navy officers changed under Mike Noonan in 2019. Now they're named after decorated and distinguished RAN officers, and one division is named for that first Director of RANS, Chief Officer Sheila McClellan. She deserves her place in the Naval Pantheon. She did all she could to give her dedicated young women a place in the Navy where they could stand alongside and equal to their brother officers and sailors. Her vision is now in place in the cradle of the RAN Officer Corps, which has been an equal opportunity naval college for the last 40 years since gender integration took place in 1985. The poet Tennyson gave his elderly seaman Ulysses, heading out to sea for the last time, a line to say about the passage of time. Though much is taken, much abides. Well, this much abides in our modern RAN. Our officers and sailors share your intense pride in our 125 years of Navy service to Australia and the cause of freedom in peace and war since Federation. They understand that they're each an important part of a very long chain, and they must work in teams to take the strain together. The links in that chain are our naval history and heritage. That chain will not fail through lack of diligence or attention while they're on watch. If ever they're required to fight at sea, I have every confidence that the men and women of our serving Navy will give their last full measure of devotion to duty, as did those of the greatest generation who came before us. We all hope that their devotion will never be put to the ultimate test, and that regional tensions can be wisely managed and de-escalated, so that the tragedy of war at sea, on, above and under the water is permanently avoided. Unfortunately, that state is not guaranteed. With our allies, we may have to face the full spectrum of complex maritime challenges in the Indo-Pacific in this decade or in the next. If we want peace, we continue to prepare our fleet for war. If the tension can be managed, then our growing and more capable Navy will continue its historical role in peacetime, the deterrence of violence, the defence of Australia and its interest, and the shaping of our region's security in partnership with our allies. Our ships and people will continue to be a force for good in the world. Navy will perform normal constabulary duties and provide what our ancient naval prayer asks for: protection for those who pass on the seas upon their lawful occasions. Navy will deal with seaborne criminals, protect our fisheries and our seabed cables, offer humanitarian aid and disaster relief to our Pacific neighbour, and of course to our own citizens. So to conclude, tonight I've been looking back from the ridgeline of my naval and military experience at what I have seen over nearly half a century of service around the Commonwealth in the years 1974 to 2023. I can see and discern the changing light and shade of the Navy's cultural landscape since I went to sea with my medical officer father. That period, of course, covers only the most recent chapters of the much longer naval history stretching back to 1914, over which your Victorian chapter of our Society keeps watch, and over which your magazine Broadside keeps us well informed. Looking ahead, the visibility is less clear, and I fear the wind is rising and coming from the north. The future is, of course, unknowable, but there may be uncharted reefs and strong currents ahead. The whole ADF, and indeed the whole nation, not just the Naval's special sea dutymen, may have to suddenly close up and even go to action stations. We all hope not, but who can tell? Nothing is certain. All I can say with great confidence is that our modern, next-generation Navy culture, with which our people at sea and ashore will confront that challenge, is modern, appropriate to the times we live in, fit for purpose, remembers its past, and as Admiral Vat Smith used to say about his fleet era, is second to none. I believe that one of the most reassuring features of this challenging decade we're in the middle of is the unchanging integrity, steadfastness, self-discipline, courage, skill, and devotion to duty, and the men and women who serve in the Australian Defence Force, and particularly in our Navy. Sailors and officers who serve in our soon-to-be re-equipped, enlarged, and more capable Royal Australian Navy are the equal of all those who came before them. They train unremittingly with our allies, so that if required to do so, they can live up to the Navy's mission, which is to fight and win at sea. Now, may I ask, to conclude my address, that you rise and drink the Navy's traditional toast for a Monday night mess dinner. It's remained unchanged for centuries. Members of the Society, ladies and gentlemen, our toast tonight is our ships at sea. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as your desserts are appearing in front of you, Desmond has agreed to take any questions or comments that you might have. So if anybody's got a comment, personally I just wonder where I can sign on again. It was certainly a tour de force of our past and our present and probably where we're heading in the future. And I'm sure you're all grateful for the story he had to tell.